It is truly our great pleasure to receive you here, Professor Karoly. And I've heard Professor Karoly's installation lecture as professor at Uppsala University in 2016, and I was absolutely amazed by these real discoveries about the vast and culture and education level of Turkic people. And I felt since then that it should be my duty to bring this knowledge to my Kazakh friends. And now this dream has come true. I have on one hand become honorary consul of Kazakhstan in Sweden, and I've got possibility with Professor Karoly here. And Professor Karoly is professor of Turkic languages at Uppsala University. He has a very productive career with studies of Turkic runic script. And he has been educated in Hungary, where he originated from. He was active in Germany, and since 4 years ago, he is installed in Uppsala, in the heart and old ancient capital of Sweden. So, Professor Karoly, we are really happy to have you here and to listen to your talk. Please.
Thank you so much. It's really my pleasure to be here, and I hope you will enjoy this talk. And this is just a summary, because this is a huge history. If you look at the history of the Turkic peoples all around the vast territory of Eurasia, then you can have 100 hours to discuss all the details. And this is what we actually try to do at Uppsala University, to teach languages, to teach history, to teach culture, literature, and so on. I have a special course that's 12 lectures, long lectures, from the beginning up to the modern times. And it's not enough just for a cursory overview. So if you want to go deep in one specific topic like this, Kazakh, that may be the most interesting for you, you could imagine an independent course, 10, 12 lectures, just providing a summary of the Kazakhs from the establishment, from the Kipchak tribes up to the modern times. So it's a very, very huge history. It's amazing for us to see this very vivid life the Turkic peoples provided in their history from the very beginning, with all the different cultures, with all the different melting spots in Eurasia, how they met the Persians, how they met the Chinese, how they met the Russians, how they met all the people around the core land of the Turks. That's fascinating. So I think, for me as a scientist, it's really a pleasure to work with the Turkic languages, work with the history of the Turks. It's just full of interesting things. That's what I cannot summarize, unfortunately, now in my short lecture, but I try to give a summary about the runiform writing system, which the Turks established, used in their history for long centuries, and now it's part of the Turkic culture, a very important part of the Turkic culture. We have to preserve it, we have to analyze it, we have to understand what it means for the modern nations, what it provides as knowledge, as written material, because sometimes we just look at these sources, these are texts written in a Turkic language, so we can analyze syntax, we can analyze the words and things, but behind the words we have a living culture, we have a possibility to understand what happened to the Turks 1,000 years ago, what kind of ideology they had, how they organized themselves, how they lived and so on. So it's much, much more than just written letters carved in stones, let's say. It's full of interesting things. And if you want to learn more about your own culture or about the culture of the Turks, you can, of course, come to us. You are mostly welcome to join our courses. I have a history course, for example, providing an overview. This time, in this bad corona times, the only possible outcome of this pandemic is that we have now most of our courses online. So you can join from Stockholm, you can join from Lund, from Göteborg, from distant remote places of the country, and it's very easy to join or become registered on this course. So that's maybe the only advantage of the corona pandemics. But now I would like to start with my presentation. The title is The Turks and the Runiform Writing System of Eurasia. It doesn't work with the pointer. Now it is working. Maybe I have come to this position. I would like to start with a short introduction. And Sweden is the best place to start with such a discussion, because in another European country like Germany or France, it would be difficult to relate to something which you have here locally. That's the runic writing system used by the Germanic peoples. And as we will see, the origin of the Turkic writing system is debated. It's the same problem with the Scandinavian runes. We have some ideas about the origin and background of the system, but it's not entirely clear how the system has been created and developed through the centuries. So there's much to do regarding this question. It's relatively old. The earliest findings are from the 2nd century Common Era, and most of them are from Germany, Denmark, and Sweden. Actually, here in Sweden, it's really the most important country for such studies. But even in the UK, there are some examples of the runes. And the classification is maybe not very relevant for us, but we have the Old Germanic version of the runes, which are representing an earlier stage of the Germanic languages, and the Scandinavian inscriptions, which are later and more coming closer to the Swedish language or the Scandinavian languages. And this is just one example which you find on the internet as well. It shows how the letters look like. If you have already seen Turkic uniform letters, you see that they are sometimes quite similar, but some letters are completely different. So if you know one, you cannot read the other, and it shows for non-professionals that they are actually not related to one another. So some people try to point out earlier that the Turkic letters are related to the Scandinavian letters. It's not true. These are completely separated systems developed entirely different forms. And this is another summary about the earliest Turkic peoples in Eurasia. The most important Kaganates is uniform tradition. So if you look at the Old Turks, the so-called Köktürk Kaganate, they have two, the first and the second Köktürk Kaganate. They use the uniform writing system. They wrote long texts. And these are inscriptions or stones which you can find in Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. These are the most important places. And Kazakhstan is on the list. So we have inscriptions which are now in Kazakhstan. And we can mention the Old Uyghur Kaganate. It's the continuation of the Old Turkic Kaganate in today's Mongolia. And after the coming of the Kyrgyz people, the Uyghurs came down to Xinjiang. That's their place now, where they live. And they established a kingdom there. In that time, the Turks, the Uyghurs, maybe it's better to say the Uyghurs, continuously lost their nomadic tradition, and they became sedentary people. And they learned Central Asian cultures like Buddhism, Manichaeism, Eastern Christianity, and they lost this tradition slowly. And they started to use other writing systems. They started to write other things than they did earlier. But we have very interesting examples how they preserve this tradition for maybe a period of 200 years, up to the 11th, 12th century maybe. And this is still Mongolia and Xinjiang, the administrative territory in West China. We can mention the Yenisei Kyrgyz Khaganate, which is around the Yenisei River in today's Russia, especially Altai Republic, Tiva Republic, and the Republic of Khakassia. These are the most important regions, and this is still the 9th and 10th century, so relatively early periods of the Turkic history. And the two last groups are not well known, but very important for us here in Europe, because this shows that the Turks came to Europe relatively early. As far as we understand, they had to be there in the 5th and 6th century already. And it is East Russia, it's Ukraine, and the Caucasus. So it's a relatively early movement to Europe. And the Avars, who were most likely of Turkic origin, reached the Carpathian Basin, that's today's Hungary, in the 6th century. So you see that the Turks in Mongolia and the Turks in Middle Europe existed at the same time. So in the 6th century, we had Turkic-speaking tribes in Europe and in Mongolia at the other end of the nomadizing territories. It's very important to emphasize that this movement of the Turks happened that early. And this is today's Hungary and Romania. And this is I hope it's what you can read now on the map, showing that this is Mongolia, this is West China, this is Kazakhstan, and the western part of the old Turkic Kazakhstan Khaganate situated in this place, actually, today's Kazakhstan. And this was a very, very important part of the empire. In certain cases, we can say that it was the center, the Mongolian part of the Khaganate was the center of the Khaganate. But when it comes to the evolution of the runiform writing system, maybe this part was more important than this part, the Kazakhstani part. And these are the European Turks, the Kazakhs, for example, here in South Russia and the Caucasus. And now I would like to show you some nice pictures, just to get an idea about the inscriptions and the beautiful texts created by the Turkish-speaking peoples. And this is a landscape. It was drawn by Finnish researchers at the end of the 19th century. So it's a very, very early documentation of the Yenisei region. Some Finnish researchers got interested in discovering Siberia. They came to the region and documented everything in a wonderful way. And it shows all the stones which were erected by the Yenisei Turks, and most of them had writings on them. So it's a fascinating landscape, I would say. But something interesting happened that I have to say before I show the pictures. Because the Turks, these nomadizing Turks in their Khaganate, established this writing system. They started to use it. They started to spread it over the whole territory. It was really a Turkic writing system because it was used only by the Turkic-speaking tribes, and became the alphabet of all these Khaganates. And the flourishing era of This period is the 7th and 8th century maybe. But due to the fact that all these Turks became sedentary, lost their nomadizing culture, like the Uyghurs when they came down to China, they lost their nomadizing lifestyle and they learned new cultures, Buddhism, or later the other Turks in Central Asia learned Islam. They lost slowly this tradition. They started to use the Arabic writing system, they started to use several other writing systems. Another interesting history, but it resulted a big change in the culture. And the Turks started to forget this as a consequence of disappearing nomadism, because it was part of the nomadic culture. And up to the 11th century, we see that the Turks used the writing system, but then after it, they changed to something else. As I said, it was the Arabic writing system, or it was the Uyghur writing system, a special system for writing Buddhist texts, for example, and it became a lost knowledge. From the 11th, from the 12th century up to the 19th century, nobody used the writing system and nobody was able to read it. And these became sacred places actually for the people living there. They thought, oh, it's something beautiful, it's something interesting, and it's something related to the old culture, but nobody knew actually at some point that it was written by the Turks, it belonged to the Turkic culture. You know that the coming of the Mongols changed anyhow the conditions in Central Asia, and people might thought, oh, maybe they belong to the Mongols. So that became a completely unknown and unclear set of documents. But in the 19th century, Western scholars, it is related to Russian colonialism, of course. There was an increasing interest to discover Siberia, to discover eastern parts of Asia, and many scholars, Scandinavian scholars, Finnish scholars, Dutch or German or Russian researchers started to discover this territory. They came to the Yenisei Basin, they came to Mongolia, and they realized, oh, there's something here. We have big stones with interesting letters on them, but nobody had any idea about that they were written by the Turks. And a lucky situation is that the Kurtagian inscription, one of the most famous inscriptions, had a Chinese summary. So summary in Chinese language, which the scholars could read. And then in this summary, there's reference to the Turks, that they are the Turks, they erected, and this is their culture and so on. And then at that point, the scholars realize, oh yeah, then they know that it belongs to the Turks. So it's part of the Turkic culture, and it must be a Turkic language. And then some scholars like Wilhelm Thomsen, a Danish linguist, and Wilhelm Radloff, a scholar who was active in Russia but with German roots, they started to discover and decipher the inscriptions. It was a kind of competition. It was very important at that time who would be the first. And interestingly enough, it was Wilhelm Thomsen who managed to discover or decipher the letters, and he published the book in 1893. It's a rather old book in which he presents the whole system, the letters, the values of the letters, how to read the letters, and then from that point of time, we again are able to read the runiform inscriptions, and we know that this is Turkic, and this belongs to the Turks, and it represents the culture of the Turks, and it's invaluable for the history of Central Asia because it provides a lot of information which we otherwise missed. So it's really amazing what these sources provide as knowledge. And these are the oldest Turkic sources, as far as we know. Maybe the Turks have used other things earlier, but nothing remained. So this is really the earliest group of sources, and this is a table from Thompson's book showing the letters and the interpretation, how the letters should be read. This letter has a different color. I marked it because this is, for example, a letter which you find in the Scandinavian writing system as well. It's just a straight line, but here it's an S or an esh in the Turkic text, and in the Scandinavian inscriptions it has another value, it's an E. So you see that sometimes the letters match, look the same, but have different values. And now we know a bit more than Thompson has written in this book, but we can say that his interpretation is 99% correct, so there's not much to add to this list. It's almost perfect. And now we really start with some nice examples. The first is the so-called Tonypuk inscription. He was a statesman, very important person in the second Turkic Khaganate, and this stone has been erected for the memory of Tonypuk as maybe the most important statesman in the old Turkic times. He stabilized the empire. He helped the Khagan to extend the borders of the empire. So he was really, really important for the Turks, and he himself was most likely a Turk. So this is from the Old Turkic Khaganate. The second is from the Yenisei Kyrgyz Khaganate, from a region which now we have in Russia. This is the Bible inscription. These are usually smaller in size, and the texts are also shorter and represent a language which is a bit different than the language represented by the Tonypuk inscription. That's also very interesting and maybe important to emphasize that even in that time, in the 8th century, it was not one Turkic language, but we can define several languages or at least dialects differing from one another. It shows that the emergence of the modern language or the separation of the groups started already in that time. Of course, the big evolution of the modern Turkic languages happened under the Mongols, but we see that certain differentiation started in the 8th century already. And this is just one example which we discussed yesterday with Dennis in my Old Turkic lecture. This is one short quotation from the Tonypuk inscription. We don't have to read it in Turkish or Turkic. It's enough to look at the translation. Without having found their Khan, the tribe of the Turks was parted from North China and got itself a Khan. It's a very important sentence because it shows that the Turks had in the 8th century relation to North China. And they were subject to North China for a short period of time. They became independent, and they have chosen their own Khan. And it was an interesting relation between Chinese and Turkic tribes of the Turkic Empire and the Chinese Empire, let's say. And the Turks did something bad. They became independent, but later they joined again to the Chinese. And according to the description, because that's most that's the most important message of the stone, that the Turks should preserve their independence. And it was a bad thing to join the Chinese, became part of the Chinese Empire. And that was the punishment which came after it by God. It's Tengri, of course, in Turkey, but here I translate it into heaven because that was the heaven God. And God said as follows: I have given you a Khan, but you abandoned your Khan and submitted again China. So that was bad to do. And as a punishment for this submission to Chinese, the Turks had to die. That was the punishment by God. And the message is clear. You have to preserve your independence all the time. And this was the most important thing, how the inscription started. And we can think about it, but it's still important, I think, preserving your independence. If you think about Kazakhstan, if you think about other Turkic nations, internal relations, external relations, connection to other countries are important, but you have to identify yourself. You have to preserve your independence. And you have to have a vision about your future as an independent nation without being subjected to others. So that's at least one message that you can take from this text, which was written in the 8th century. It's still actual, I would say. And this is a completely different type of stone. It's from the Altai Republic, and it's a huge rock. So it's not a carved stone erected at some place. It was already there in the nature, and the Turks carved different things on these stones. Quite often, these are figures describing lifestyle. You see that people with arrow, sitting on horse, it's a typical nomadic way of living. But sometimes these inscriptions or petroglyphs include text as well. So some short messages or short sentences about different happenings. But they are quite often figurative with descriptions of life. This is another interesting example. It shows how the culture changes. The Uyghurs came down to Xinjiang, became sedentary, became Buddhists, but they preserved this tradition for a long period of time, at least for 200 years. And since they became sedentary, they started to use paper, they started to use brush, pencil to write their text, but they still remember this culture and came to the conclusion, we no longer carve the letters in stone, we have better techniques. It's like, we used a typewriter 30 years ago, now we use a mobile phone to write text. That's the kind of development in that time, changing from stone to paper. And then they wrote the letters by brush, and it resulted in another lookout. So if you compare the letters, here they are very straight, no curvy lines, because it's not easy to carve a letter in stone. But if you write on paper with a brush, you can have calligraphic variants, you can write it more easily. By the way, here it's Türk Bodum. These letters here, Türk Bodum. So it's on the stone that this is the tribe of the Turks. So coming back to this, it's a very interesting example showing how a Turkic-speaking group changes the culture, changes the systems of writing and so on. And this is one example from that book. It's a book of omen. It means that you have 3 ankle bones and you die with these. Shikkemi in Turkish. And you get different results. It has 3 sides, so you can have 1, 2, or 3 on each of the bones. And according to the result, you read your future from that book. And if you have 3 times 2, then you get this message. And you can read it, and it gives you a future telling. I'm Tensi. In the morning and evening, I enjoy sitting on the golden throne. No, thus this omen is good. So you can imagine a positive future on the basis of this omen, but it's very difficult to understand what it really means. And this is again a very interesting question of science. We understand the words, we understand the sentences, but do we understand the message of this? I'm not sure whether it's easy to do so. Sometimes, if some of the proverbs, let's say, still exist in Kazakh or in Turkish or in other Turkic languages, then we have the possibility to understand the message. But in many, many cases, it's very difficult what it exactly means, what symbol the golden throne had that time. And of course, we see the influence of the Chinese culture. So Tensi was the name of the Chinese emperor. It means that the Uyghurs were influenced that time by the Chinese a bit because they named the emperor in the text. And this is again a completely different object. This is a flask from Southwest Russia, from the Kazakh Khaganate, and it has the runiform letters here carved in it. It's an earthenware actually, and this is a reconstruction here how the letters can be read, but this is a still undeciphered text. We don't know exactly what it means. It's an important task of science to provide an interpretation of the text. Of course, there are some trials. Some scholars try to decipher the letters, but it's still very, very disputed, and I wouldn't say that we understand the text. It's better to say that we don't understand the text. And it's partly due to the shortness. If you have a short text, you cannot identify reoccurring parts, words, or suffixes. So it's really challenging. But it shows that the Turks in Southwest Russia used the runiform writing system, and it was a living culture of these empires. And this is another object. This is a piece of bone with some letters on it. It's 8 letters. Of course, it's very, very short. Some of the letters, maybe this one, which we discussed already, as S in the Orhan inscriptions, and this may be as Ye, but when maybe it's a G, but if you look at the others, they don't occur in the Orhan inscriptions. They are letters which have been used by the Avars, exclusively by the Avars. And therefore it's very, very difficult to provide interpretation to them. And again, this is a category of undeciphered inscription. So there's much to do in science still. And now I would like to tell you something about the spread of the writing system. That's a very interesting question, because we see it in Mongolia, in Europe, but we don't know where it has been created, how it has been created, and how it spread actually among the Turks. It's a huge territory, 1,000 kilometers to the east, to the west, but I think the most plausible one is that it is a North Aramaic origin, and the Iranian peoples in the region contributed to it. The Turks, that time in the 7th and 8th century, had relatively strong connection to Iranian peoples. They are the Sogdians and the Saka people. And the Turks had a quite flourishing living together at that time with these Iranian peoples. And the Iranians, like the Sogdians, were not nomads, but people dealing with commercial things. So they distributed products, they transmitted things from one place to another. And this is how they came to the Turks and influenced the Turks. And by the help of the Sogdians, the Turks created their own writing system, which goes back to a kind of North Aramaic writing system with the addition of Greek letters. That's a very complex question. We don't have time to go in details and discuss the evolution, but this is what we can say, that this goes back to a writing system used by the Iranian peoples at that time. And the Turks modified it, adapted it. Of course, Iranian languages are completely different. The Iranian languages have less vowels, more consonants. The Turkic languages have much more vowels. So the Turks had to figure out a system, because the direct application of the North Aramaic system was not adequate. So they changed it, they modified it in order to make it applicable for Turkic language. So that's really an interesting contribution made by the Turks. And the script has different variants. As I said, the Avars use letters, which we don't see in the Mongolian inscriptions. There are letters which appear only in the Yenisei region, not in Mongolia. So small differences can be described. And I think the Old Turkic Khaganate made a standardization effort. You know, in the beginning, when you develop a writing system, you can write certain words differently. You have to establish an orthography. If you pronounce a word, then you can pronounce it differently. Like a Kazakh pronounces a word differently than a Turk in Turkey. So if these languages or dialects are closer to one another, then maybe you have the same word with slightly different pronunciations. Then you can ask, oh well, how should I write it? Should I use this letter or that letter? And the Old Turkic Khaganate in Mongolia made such an effort that time that they standardized the writing system, and they try to establish a system how to write something. And that's an amazing system, really. A very, very systematic way of writing words with the runiform letters. There are only some very, very few exceptions which are not following the rule, but otherwise that's a very, very accurate system from an orthographical point of view. It's fascinating, really.
Excuse me. I don't know if you mentioned the century. What century got influenced by Iranian and other systems of Turkic language?
Sorry, which?
See, you didn't mention the century. What did you?
Yeah.
The influence.
That's a good question. I would say the Turks started to develop a system in the 6th century, maybe. And the first examples are available from the 8th century. It means that earlier maybe they used wooden objects or objects which couldn't survive until now, and therefore we don't have.
But the Iranian influence, when was that?
That started in the 6th century, maybe earlier, but that's a big question whether we can find traces of this influence in historical sources or not. But they were surely there in the 6th century. when the Turks appear in the Chinese sources in the year 552, let's say, they appear as a tribe dealing with metallurgy. So this is not a typical thing what a nomadic people would do. And this culture, metallurgy and dealing with iron and other things, surely comes from the Iranians because they started this. So in the 6th century, we can speak about the Iranian influence. Maybe in earlier centuries as well, but that's very difficult to describe. Coming back to the variants of the script, there are different classifications, but we might say that we can start from the east to the west, and we can describe the different variants. We can start from deciphered to non-deciphered, and this is the same track. On the east, we have the deciphered inscriptions. On the west, we have the non-deciphered inscriptions. And in the middle, like in Kazakhstan or in Kyrgyzstan, we have inscriptions that we can read some words. Then we have letters which we cannot interpret. Then again, words which can be read and interpreted, but not entirely. And on the east, we have long inscriptions. We are approaching to the west. The texts are getting shorter and shorter. So it shows that the culture was well established in Mongolia and Kazakhstan, and coming to the west, maybe the Turks living there partly got this culture, but not, it didn't become an established culture among them, or something like that. And as I mentioned, some inscriptions from Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan include letters which we are still unable to interpret. I will show some examples. It shows that Thomsen's decipherment from the end of the 19th century is an enormous contribution to scholarship, and it's very, very important for Turkology, but it's not complete. We need research to understand what the Turks in Europe have been produced, and we have to provide solution for those undeciphered inscriptions. And this is an actual task of science of today. I made this very simple description to illustrate the spread of the writing system. So these are the Iranian peoples here, and this is the classical core land of the Turkic-speaking people, and this is the place, I guess, where the Turks first met the Iranians. And this is today's Kazakhstan, and the system came to Mongolia from this direction. I cannot imagine that it came directly from the Iranian inhabited area to Mongolia. So it came through this area. And then it went to Europe, went to the Uyghurs and to the Kyrgyz people. So this is how we can summarize the evolution. And it shows exactly what we saw on the previous slide with the classification and the differences between the regions. And now a summary about the unsolved problems, those problems which we are dealing with at the moment. On the one hand, we have letters which are rarely used. This one, for example, like a bow tie, it appears on the Orhan inscriptions, on the Yenisei inscriptions, but we only have some, very few examples, and therefore it's difficult to interpret this particular letter. And some scholars came to the conclusion that it means bash, so this is how we should read the word, like bas in Kazakh, as you know. And lik is another interpretation. It shows the difficulties. So some prominent scholars came to the conclusion this letter should be interpreted as Bash. Other scholars like Sherbak from Russia said no, the reading is Lik, and this is how we should interpret the letter. Some other scholars who were a bit more cautious said no, we don't interpret the letter. We don't know the exact value and meaning. The other letter is maybe more interesting because it appears in a short inscription from Kyrgyzstan, from the Talas river, and it appears in Eastern Europe also, in the Kumara castle of North Caucasus, on a flask. I've shown this already. And some scholars think it means Z as a sound, other scholars say no, it means G. So it's really, really difficult to take a stance. And this is just an illustration. This is the most famous inscription from the Talas region, from Kyrgyzstan, and this is one letter, and this is the same letter again. So we don't know how to read these letters. This is a letter which we have on the Orhon inscriptions, like Ye. This is N, but we don't know what it means. We don't know what it means. We don't know the meaning of this. So half of the letters are unknown, actually.
Can I ask you?
Please.
You did say that you can read them, but you can't read the message of this.
Yes.
Yeah, but there is people who work with runes, but not as scientists. But like гадание.
Future telling or
yeah. And they tell people that every single rune has the strong power, strong meaning of blah blah blah. Did you try to work with them? Like
no, no, because,
or are you just laughing on them?
Yeah, because if I look at these sources, I see the culture of the Turks, and I would say then it should be a Turkic text written in the Turkic language. And I'm interested in the language, and I would like to decipher the text written there. Whether a sign has a message beyond the language, saying that it's a good sign, it illustrates that you will get a child, or whether you will have a bad future eventually, that's possible because all signs can have such meanings. But I think those Turks who have written this text wanted to communicate something, wanted to say things like, I'm the Kagan, my name is X or Epsilon, and so on. And I think that this should be such an interpretable text. If it's not interpreted, or if it's not interpretable, it's just symbolism, then it's not interesting for me because I won't understand the meaning of these symbols from the 8th century.
They do learn so deeply all the rules in every country, in different countries. They have like own rules and trying to like them. When they story future telling to people, but it is one thing, but они же больше изучают, чем они рассказывают там про догадают. Ну, то есть они же тоже изучают не как scientific.
They do research.
Yeah. But
I think it could be like
it's not official. Their work's not official, and it's not scientifically approved, but it is approved in their eyes, in the idea.
What we try to do, and this is what we discuss with our students as well, how to understand the origin of the letters, because sometimes the letters have logographic background. So one letter evolves from an object, and if you look at this letter, we discussed it with them. This looks like a moon, right? A half moon. How is it in Kazakh? Ay. And this is a letter meaning ye. So maybe this letter has such a pictographic background, saying that they modified the letter in a way that it looked like the moon because it's I in the Turkic languages, and this symbolizes at the same time the sound ye. And this is how you can relate the picture and the sound. And we can go back to the picture of letters by Thomson. And we can look at maybe this letter. Some scholars think that it looks like a horse. And this is a T, and you know, horse is up in the Turkic languages. So if this symbolism is really there, then we can say that the T letter has this shape because we have the word at in the Turkic language meaning horse. And this one, what is that? It's an arrow, right? How is it in the Turkic languages? Ok. Ok. And this is a key, the consonantal part of the word. And we can have maybe some other signs. This is a fishing net, and this is ar in many Turkic languages. And this is a letter representing the sound of ra. So if you like, you can say that some of these letters might represent objects because the sounds represented by the letters are matching the objects. But I wouldn't go beyond this. I think this is what we can do on a scientific ground and not more. I don't want to say that it doesn't have place in our life, future telling and things, but it's beyond science, at least for me, and this is why I wouldn't touch these questions. So let's come back to the spread of the writing system as a summary, coming from the Iranian peoples with modifications, and these modifications, as I said, are contributions by the Turks, because they shaped the system to make it accommodate it to their own languages. And then the unsolved problems with this special letter, like a letter.
The letter is from the photo before, like picture before. It was G or
Yes, exactly.
So these two letters are unsolved.
Exactly. And we have many other unsolved letters. These are just two examples. As I said, this one in the middle. That's also very problematic because we don't have it in the Orhan inscriptions, in the Mongolian inscriptions. And there are always new publications or new trials to solve these questions, but I would say they are still unconvincing. And the same letter in the castle of Kumara. So this is carved in the stone of the wall by the nomads. And now we arrived at Europe. We arrived at Kazakhs and the Avars, who established their Khaganates in Europe. When it comes to the Kazakhs, it's interesting to mention that we have certain information about them in Arabic and Byzantine sources, and they became followers of Judaism. It's a very interesting history. I can say it briefly. They had options that time to choose Islam, to choose Orthodox Christianity, or to choose Judaism. And they had a kind of competition. They organized a competition with representatives of these religions. They came to the Kazakh court and they tried to say, my religion is better than yours. And the Kazakhs decided to choose Judaism, but not because Judaism was considered better by themselves, it was a political decision. If you look at the map, you will understand this. This is the Kazakh Empire. And from this place, modern Anatolia, Turkey, this is the Byzantine Empire. Exactly next to the Kazakhs, a very dangerous empire, right? And here, this is the Muslim world from the other direction. So from both directions, you have two big empires with two influential religions. I think they choose Judaism to show that, we remain independent. We don't need Islam, we don't need Christianity. We need something else to strengthen our independence. And again, coming back to this point you mentioned in the beginning, independence was very important for the Kazakhs and Judaism was a means to express their independence in religious terminology as well. So, and as far as we know, they spoke a Bulgar-Chuvash type Turkic language. It's a language which you can relate to Chuvash, which is spoken in the Volga region. And if we look at the Avars, it's more or less the same. We have not much, but little information. The sources, Latin and Byzantine sources, tell a lot about their history, but less about their language and culture. And they became followers of the Byzantine Christianity because they were really close to the Byzantine court and in the Balkans. But the language of the Avars is still a big question. We have a huge, huge question mark. I would say that many things somehow allow us to think that they spoke a Turkic language, but it's still a scientific discovery and an open question. If we look at the Avars, that's very interesting because in the sources available, we see only titles and proper names and no common verbs. And you know, if we look at the Kazakh, maybe a Kazakh person can have the name Ali. So this is a name coming through Islam. The name doesn't say anything about the background of the person, the language of the person. So even if we see our titles, our proper names, they say almost nothing about the linguistic and ethnic background of the peoples. So therefore, we should handle these words carefully. We should disregard these words. We should remove these words from our analysis. We need common words like horse, like plant names and so on. They are more stable and they can tell us something about the language. And then we ask this very question, which language did the Avars speak? Some scholars say the Turkic language, some other scholars say no, they spoke a Mongolic language, some others say Iranian. And this is just an example. This is a golden ball. It's really golden, a very, very beautiful object. Now it's in Vienna, in the National Museum of Austria. And runiform letters are available on this object. Of course, it's not carved. It's a special technique to write the runiform letters, but you can identify these are nothing else than runiform letters. It shows that they use the system, and they had this element in their culture. There's one key to the problem of language. I show it immediately. This is the boiler inscription on another bowl, a fantastic, beautiful golden bowl. This one, a drinking bowl, a huge piece, a huge object. And here in the middle, as you see, there are letters. And these letters are Greek letters, better to say Byzantine letters. And this is not in Greek, not in Byzantine Greek. This is another language. But it was written by the Avars. Since they decided to follow the Byzantine Christianity, they started to use the Greek letters, and they took this culture. But this text was written by their own language. And in this case, we can say that we know the value of the Byzantine letters. We can read the letters, and this is an interpretation of the letters. And this is our task now, to say what language it is, how to interpret this. And it's not a surprise, but there are 14 different interpretations. Some scholars thought it's German, some other scholars thought it's Hungarian, it's Mongolic, it's Tungusic, it's Turkic, and so on and so on. So really, so many different interpretations. But I would say, not because I'm a Turkologist, that it's most like a text in a Turkic language. And it matches with our history, our knowledge of history as well. So it might be the real answer. Then this is a text written by the Avars, and the Avars spoke a Turkic language and used the Greek letters to write in Turkic. That time in the 7th, 8th, 9th century, approximately. And of course, it's very difficult to discuss now the text itself, the linguistic analysis and so on. But if you look at it, and it's really Turkic, and it's again a Bulgar Chuvash type Turkic language, very close to Chuvash spoken in the Volga region. So Khazar and Avar languages relatively different from the languages spoken in Central Asia linguistically, but still Turkic languages, building a different branch of Turkic. And this is extremely important for us, because we can show that from the 5th century up to the modern times, we have Turkic-speaking tribes in this region, and these are the objects remained from that culture. And now we have more or less the linguistic tools to read and analyze these objects. But of course, we think about future, we think about future possibilities. The inscriptions from Europe are relatively short and fragmentary and improperly documented. So it's our aim to do a proper modern documentation of all these objects, and maybe with computer-aided technologies, we will be able to read the text, interpret the text, and understand a bit more the culture of those Turkic-speaking peoples who came to Europe from the 5th century. And this is a multidisciplinary method. We need help from archaeologists who can document these objects properly with better technological tools. We need a computational linguist to write the computer codes which we need for the analysis. And of course, Turkologists or philologists who understand the language are also needed. So it should be a teamwork, an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach. And this is what we are hoping for very much, because that's I think, a very, very important contribution to the better understanding of the Turkic culture in Europe, at least. And this is just for your interest. If you want to learn a bit more about the inscriptions, there's a website. It's very good and huge. Turk. It's a site hosted in Kazakhstan by the language committee of the Ministry of Culture and Information in 3 languages. It's Kazakh, Russian, and English, and it's really designed for the broadest public. So there are different translations, interpretation, nice pictures. So you can visit that website and you can learn a bit more about these inscriptions. And we also started to establish a database here at Uppsala University. It's relatively small in the beginning because we don't have such big money and effort, but Kazakhstan and Kazakh Ministry of Culture can provide. That's what we cannot compare. So it's a small project and it includes only some inscriptions, but it is designed for scientific purposes. So the purposes are also a bit different. But you can start with this Kazakh website if you are interested in this culture. You will love it. It's really beautiful. It's very interesting, and it's really good that it is available in 3 languages. Our database is only in English. So that was for today what I wanted to tell you about these things, about this beautiful culture and fascinating history. If there's questions, of course, we can have a discussion if we have time.
Do we have time?